I need you to pay very close attention because what I'm about to show you explains everything about Meghan's behavior over the past 6 months.
The cameras were ready for a peace story. A quiet royal reset the world believed was finally within reach. But behind closed legal doors, whispers of a deeper fracture were already circulating. What began as a fragile agreement soon turned into a storm of allegations, strategy, and silence, revealing a royal conflict where perception mattered just as much as power. The moment Meghan's legal team reportedly submitted their extensive rebuttal, the tone of the conflict shifted from private disagreement to something far more strategic. Observers described it not as a simple custody negotiation, but as a calculated escalation that placed both reputation and legacy on trial. Allegations surfaced, suggesting institutional pressure, while palace-aligned sources quietly dismissed the claims as part of a larger narrative battle. In royal disputes, the truth rarely arrives in a single headline. It unfolds through layers of interpretation, silence, and timing. According to commentators following the case, the filing introduced a framework that reframed Harry not as a prince shaped by duty, but as a father whose stability could be scrutinized under modern legal standards. Mentions of past behavior, resurfaced incidents, and psychological evaluation requests became the center of debate. Supporters argued it was a legitimate legal tactic, while critics saw it as a dramatic shift away from the couple's earlier image of unity. For audiences watching from afar, the real shock wasn't just the accusations, it was the unraveling of a narrative that had once promised healing against royal pressure. At the same time, palace insiders, speaking cautiously, through unofficial channels, emphasized restraint. There were no public rebuttals, no emotional press conferences, only carefully measured responses that framed the situation as a matter of child-focused stability rather than public spectacle. This contrast created a powerful visual divide. One side appeared loud and reactive, the other calm and immovable. In the psychology of royal storytelling, silence often becomes a message of authority, and many analysts believe that strategy began to reshape public perception almost immediately. Financial questions added another layer of tension. Reports discussed luxury spending, brand partnerships, and disputed funding structures, though many of these details remained contested or unverified in official court records. Still, the narrative effect was undeniable. The image of a modern, royal enterprise began to look less like a fairy tale escape and more like a corporate entity under pressure. Commentators debated whether the legal fight was truly about parenting frameworks or about control of a powerful personal brand that had evolved far beyond palace walls. As the world tried to piece together the truth, a deeper question emerged. Was this conflict about justice, identity, or survival within a system older than any individual reputation? With hearings approaching and global attention intensifying, the stage was set for a battle defined not by dramatic speeches, but by documents, strategy, and the slow, relentless rhythm of institutional power. The story had only just begun, and already the lines between personal pain and public theater were becoming impossible to separate. Just when it seemed the legal storm could not grow louder, a new layer of tension quietly began forming behind the scenes. While headlines focused on courtroom arguments, the real battle shifted toward money, perception, and control of the narrative. And this was the moment viewers started asking whether the conflict was truly personal or deeply strategic. Financial disclosures slowly surfaced. Commentators began questioning the sustainability of the Sussex brand itself. Analysts didn't describe it as collapse, but rather as a turning point. A moment when the cost of maintaining a global image became part of the legal conversation. Reports discussed luxury travel, high-profile media training, and large-scale branding efforts, all framed by opposing sides in completely different ways. Supporters argued these were necessary investments for independence. Critics suggested they painted a picture of a lifestyle struggling to keep pace with expectations. What made this chapter particularly gripping was the contrast in strategy. While legal filings continued to arrive with detailed claims and counterclaims, the royal household appeared to step further into silence. No dramatic rebuttals, no emotional interviews. Instead, carefully timed appearances and subtle messaging created a sense that the institution was allowing the narrative to evolve on its own. For longtime royal watchers, this wasn't unusual. It echoed a centuries-old approach where patience becomes a form of power. Behind the scenes, financial analysts debated the future of brand partnerships linked to the couple's post-royal ventures. Rumors circulated that collaborators were reassessing long-term projects, not necessarily because of legal outcomes, but because uncertainty itself can reshape public trust. Even without confirmed decisions, the discussion alone shifted. Public sentiment, the story was no longer just about relationships. It had become a conversation about identity, influence, and the price of independence. At the center of it all were two competing narratives. One portrayed a woman attempting to rebuild her life outside institutional boundaries. The other framed the monarchy as a structure designed to endure controversy without losing stability. Viewers found themselves drawn into a psychological tug-of-war. Was this a fight for personal freedom, or a clash with a system that rarely bends under pressure? The answer seemed to change depending on which side of the Atlantic the audience watched from. Then came the quiet turning point that few expected. A carefully timed royal appearance, calm, composed, and focused entirely on children and stability, began circulating online, shifting the emotional tone of the conversation, almost overnight. Without direct confrontation, the monarchy appeared to reclaim control of the narrative through imagery rather than argument. Engagement surged, and public opinion became more divided than ever. But just as audiences began to settle into this new rhythm, whispers of a deeper strategy started to emerge. Not from tabloids, but from technical investigations tied to digital records. Something hidden within encrypted communications was reportedly about to redefine how the court viewed the entire conflict. And if those claims proved accurate, the next chapter wouldn't just challenge reputations, it could change the balance of power completely. By the time the next phase of the story unfolded, the atmosphere around the conflict had changed completely. What once looked like a loud public dispute began to feel quieter, almost clinical, as attention shifted away from emotional headlines and toward technical discoveries. Analysts following the case started speaking less about personalities and more about digital trails, encrypted timelines, and the growing sense that something significant was waiting beneath the surface. For viewers, this was the moment the narrative tightened. The discussion was no longer just about courtroom arguments or media appearances. It was about intention. Commentators described how investigators reportedly began reviewing internal planning documents tied to future projects, travel considerations, and international partnerships. None of it was presented publicly as a definitive conclusion, yet. The mere existence of these reviews introduced a powerful question into the conversation. Had the conflict always been about more than what the public could see? Across social platforms, audiences debated every detail. Some believed the scrutiny was unfair. Another example of a global figure being examined under a microscope, simply for attempting to reinvent her life. Others felt the investigation reflected the natural consequences of mixing royal identity with commercial ambition. The emotional divide grew sharper, and with every new rumor or analysis, the story became less about a single event and more about competing worldviews. Meanwhile, the royal household continued to lean into a strategy. that felt almost counterintuitive in a modern media landscape: restraint. Instead of issuing dramatic statements, senior figures focused on appearances that highlighted continuity, charity events, quiet public engagements, and moments centered on stability rather than confrontation. To many longtime observers, this approach carried its own message. It suggested that the institution was positioning itself as a steady background presence while allowing external narratives to burn themselves out. Then came what some commentators described as the digital turning point. Technical experts reportedly referenced a structured proposal connected to international expansion ideas, a document that, depending on interpretation, could be seen either as a visionary business plan or an overly ambitious strategy. The public never saw the full details, yet the discussion alone shifted the emotional energy of the story. Instead of focusing solely on personal grievances, audiences began asking whether the conflict had always included a broader vision about identity, independence, and legacy. For Harry, the narrative arc also seemed to evolve during this period. Media analysts noted a visible shift in tone. Fewer reactive statements, more emphasis on fatherhood and long-term stability. Supporters described it as a sign of personal growth, while critics interpreted it as a strategic alignment with institutional priorities. Regardless of interpretation, the contrast between earlier chapters of the saga and this quieter phase created a sense of anticipation. Something felt unfinished, as though the story was building toward a moment that would redefine how both sides were perceived. The financial conversation added another layer of complexity. Discussions about branding costs, partnerships, and public image management continued circulating online, often fueled by speculation rather than confirmed outcomes. Yet even speculation has power in a royal narrative. It reshapes expectations, influences audience sentiment, and creates the psychological tension that keeps viewers watching. As analysts debated the sustainability of modern royal branding, a deeper question emerged. Can a personal brand truly exist independently once it has been shaped by centuries of institutional symbolism? Behind the scenes, observers began noticing subtle shifts in public mood. Polls, while inconsistent depending on region, suggested audiences were growing fatigued by the constant back and forth. Many viewers expressed a desire for closure, not another dramatic escalation. This emotional fatigue played directly into the monarchy's traditional strategy. By remaining steady while the narrative cycle accelerated, the institution appeared less like an opponent and more like an enduring backdrop against which individual stories rose and fell. But just as the conversation seemed to stabilize, new whispers reignited tension. Technical discussions hinted at encrypted communications and future planning frameworks that could potentially influence legal interpretation. Importantly, none of these claims were fully verified in public filings, yet their symbolic weight was enormous. The idea that unseen strategies might exist created a sense of mystery that pulled audiences deeper into the story. This was also the moment when global media framing began to attaching moral questions to the conflict. Was the pursuit of independence being misunderstood as ambition? Was institutional protection being mistaken for control? The debate became less about right or wrong and more about perspective. For some viewers, the saga represented a cautionary tale about the risks of stepping away from a powerful system. For others, it was proof that reinvention always comes with resistance. As the days moved closer to the next major hearing, tension built not through loud revelations, but through silence. Analysts described it as the calm before a narrative storm, the point where speculation reaches its peak because the truth has not yet been fully revealed. And that silence carried its own hook. Because according to insiders following the EDDG story, The next chapter wouldn't be shaped by emotional speeches or viral headlines. It would be defined by a single discovery that could reframe everything audiences thought they understood. The real question wasn't who would win the argument. It was whether the narrative itself was about to change, and whether the audience was ready to see a completely different side of the story unfold. The closer the story moved toward its decisive phase, the more the atmosphere shifted from speculation to anticipation. For weeks, audiences had watched a narrative defined by filings, statements, and carefully framed public appearances. But as analysts began hinting that a pivotal discovery could reshape everything, the tone of coverage changed. This was no longer just a royal disagreement playing out in public view. It felt like a slow reveal, the kind that transforms how every earlier moment is understood. Inside media circles, discussion centered on a single idea: intention. Commentators debated whether earlier strategies had been misinterpreted or whether the unfolding evidence would confirm long-held suspicions about long-term planning beyond the public narrative. Viewers were drawn deeper into the psychological tension of the story. The question wasn't simply who was right, it was whether the conflict had always been building toward a moment where perception and reality collided. As legal analysts reviewed technical reports tied to digital communications and strategic planning frameworks, the public conversation became more cautious. Many outlets emphasized that interpretations varied widely, and that conclusions should not be drawn without full context. Yet the impact on audience engagement was undeniable. Every new analysis created a ripple effect, pulling viewers back into the story just as attention seemed ready to fade. Meanwhile, the monarchy's response continued to follow a pattern of quiet authority. Rather than amplifying the drama, senior figures leaned into symbolism. Appearances focused on continuity, images emphasizing family stability, and messaging that avoided direct confrontation. For longtime observers, this approach reflected a deeper understanding of narrative psychology. In moments of high tension, silence can feel louder than argument. By maintaining composure, the institution positioned itself not as an aggressor, but as a constant presence waiting for the storm to pass. For Harry, this stage of the story appeared to mark a personal turning point. Analysts noted how his public tone gradually shifted toward themes of responsibility and fatherhood. Supporters interpreted this as a move toward maturity, while critics viewed it as strategic positioning within a complex legal environment. Regardless of perspective, the change added emotional weight to the unfolding events. Audiences were no longer watching a distant royal drama. They were watching a father navigating a narrative that had grown far beyond private life. At the same time, debate around modern royal branding intensified. Commentators questioned whether it was ever possible to separate personal ambition from the symbolism of a historic institution. Some argued that the attempt to build an independent identity inevitably invited scrutiny, especially when globally, audiences remained emotionally invested in the legacy of the crown. Others believed the story revealed deeper cultural shifts, a clash between tradition and the evolving expectations of a digital-first world where personal narratives can be shaped instantly and globally. The emotional tension reached a new height when technical discussions hinted at a structured proposal that could influence how the court interpreted earlier decisions. Details remained speculative, yet the idea alone transformed public perception. Suddenly, viewers began revisiting previous chapters of the saga with new eyes, searching for clues they might have missed. Online discussions filled with theories, timelines, and competing interpretations, each trying to predict what the final reveal might mean. But even as speculation grew louder, a subtle change in public mood became visible. Audience fatigue with endless drama started to surface. Polling commentary suggested that many viewers no longer wanted escalating conflict. They wanted resolution. This shift played directly into the monarchy's traditional strategy. By remaining patient while narratives evolved, the institution appeared to offer something rare in a fast-moving media environment: stability. Behind the scenes, insiders described preparations for a decisive legal moment. Analysts suggested that the upcoming hearing would focus less on emotional arguments and more on technical clarity, a process that often feels less dramatic but carries enormous narrative weight. In royal history, turning points rarely arrive with theatrical speeches. They emerge through structured decisions that reshape the story in quiet but permanent ways. As anticipation built, the emotional stakes became clearer. For one side, the outcome represented the possibility of reclaiming narrative independence. For the other, it symbolized the protection of a legacy shaped over centuries. Viewers found themselves caught between empathy and curiosity, unsure which interpretation would ultimately define the story. And then, just as audiences began to believe they understood the direction of the narrative, a final twist entered the conversation. Analysts hinted that the next chapter would not simply confirm existing assumptions. It would challenge them. Technical findings, legal interpretations, and symbolic gestures were about to converge in a way that could redefine how the public remembered the entire saga. The question hanging over the story was no longer about individual actions. It was about legacy. Would the narrative end as a tale of independence against tradition, or as a reminder of how powerful institutions endure by waiting for time to do the work for them? As viewers leaned closer, waiting for the decisive moment, one thing became clear. The climax would not arrive through noise. It would arrive through a quiet ruling that had the potential to reshape every headline that came before it, and leave one side standing in silence while the other stepped into a future that looked very different from the one the world once imagined. By the time the final stage of the saga arrived, the energy surrounding the story felt different. Heavier, quieter, almost inevitable. Months of speculation, emotional commentary, and strategic silence had led to a single moment where narrative met consequence. Analysts described the atmosphere not as explosive, but as controlled, the kind of turning point that reshapes perception. Long after the headlines fade, when the decisive hearing began, observers noted how little drama filled the room compared to the storm outside. There were no grand gestures or emotional speeches designed for viral clips. Instead, the focus shifted toward documentation, timelines, and technical clarity. A legal fipud. Experts later described this phase as the point where storytelling gives way to structure, where every argument must stand on evidence rather than emotion. For audiences used to royal spectacle, the restraint itself felt startling. Throughout the proceedings, the contrast between the two sides became more pronounced. One narrative emphasized reinvention and independence, framing the conflict as the inevitable cost of stepping away from tradition. The other leaned into continuity, portraying the institution as a stabilizing force designed to endure beyond individual choices. This psychological divide kept viewers engaged, forcing them to confront their own biases about monarchy, modern celebrity, and the price of personal freedom. Public reaction shifted again as summaries of the decision began circulating. Analysts suggested that the outcome focused less on punishment and more on creating a long-term framework meant to prevent future conflict. To many observers, this reflected a deeper royal strategy, not to win loudly, but to outlast quietly. The language used in commentary emphasized closure rather than triumph, suggesting that the real victory belonged to stability itself. For Meghan, the aftermath represented a profound recalibration of identity. Media discussions framed her next chapter as a period of rebuilding, a transition away from the powerful narrative structures that had once defined her public image. Supporters viewed this as an opportunity for reinvention outside institutional shadows, while critics argued it marked the end of a particular era of royal storytelling. Regardless of interpretation, the shift carried emotional weight. The woman, who had once stood at the center of a global narrative, now faced a quieter, more uncertain landscape. Harry's role also evolved in the closing moments of the story. Analysts highlighted how his public tone reflected exhaustion rather than celebration. Observers described a sense of personal closure, not the dramatic reconciliation many had predicted, but a quieter acceptance of responsibility moving forward. For audiences who had followed every twist of the saga, this emotional shift felt like the true ending, a reminder that behind royal titles and media narratives were individuals navigating deeply personal consequences. Meanwhile, the monarchy itself appeared to retreat into familiar rhythms. Public engagements resumed with measured normalcy, and the absence of reactive statements reinforced the impression that the institution had achieved its goal simply by remaining steady. For some viewers, this reinforced admiration for tradition. For others, it raised complex questions about power, narrative control, and the enduring influence of royal symbolism in a modern world. As global attention gradually moved on, commentators reflected on the broader lessons of the story. Many suggested that the saga revealed a clash between two forms of power: the fast-moving energy of personal branding and the slow, enduring force of institutional legacy. The outcome did not provide a simple moral answer. Instead, it left audiences with a layered narrative shaped by perspective, emotion, and time. And yet, even in its conclusion, the story carried an echo of uncertainty. Because royal narratives rarely end completely, they fade into the background, waiting for a future moment when history reframes them once again. The final images weren't dramatic confrontations or grand declarations. They were quieter scenes: a father stepping back from the spotlight, an institution returning to routine, and a public left to interpret what the story truly meant. If there is one lesson audiences seem to carry forward, it is this: in the world of royalty, silence can be as powerful as spectacle, and time often becomes the final storyteller. The saga that once dominated headlines closed not with a dramatic crescendo, but with a sense of stillness, a reminder that some conflicts end not because one side shouts louder, but because history slowly decides which narrative endures. And as viewers reflect on everything that unfolded, one question remains hanging in the air. Was this the fall of a modern royal experiment, or simply the beginning of a new chapter written away from the crown's shadow? Share your thoughts below, because in stories like this, perspective shapes the legacy just as much as the events themselves. If you found this deep dive compelling, stay with us. The next story may be quieter, but it might reveal even more about the hidden mechanics behind power, identity, and the modern monarchy.